There was a time when everything I was doing made sense on paper, yet nothing was changing in my life. I was trying harder than ever, thinking that effort alone would eventually force reality to shift. I was planning, calculating, pushing forward with a kind of desperation that I disguised as ambition. But deep inside, I could feel something was off. It was as if I was running in circles, moving constantly but arriving nowhere different. And the strangest part was this: I had already learned everything I thought I needed to know. I understood the ideas of success, discipline, focus, persistence. I had heard all the advice that people repeat about working hard and staying consistent. Yet none of it was translating into the kind of result that actually changes a life. I wasn't lacking information. I was lacking something far deeper, something invisible but powerful enough to shape every outcome I was experiencing. There comes a moment in every life where effort alone begins to reveal its limitation. That was my moment. I remember sitting quietly, not in defeat, but in a strange state of exhaustion where even frustration begins to fade. It wasn't dramatic, there was no collapse or crisis. It was more subtle than that. It was the realization that the same mind that was creating my current reality was also the mind I was using to try and escape it. That contradiction began to sit heavily within me. I started noticing a pattern. Every time I would aim for something greater, I would carry the same inner state with me. I would want wealth, but feel lack. I would imagine success, but think from limitation. I would desire change, but internally remain unchanged. And slowly it became clear that the outer world was not resisting me, it was simply reflecting me. That realization did not come as motivation, it came as discomfort, because it meant I could no longer blame timing, people, or circumstances. It meant the foundation of my experience was something I was participating in every moment, whether I was aware of it or not. And that awareness can either break a person or begin their transformation. I began to question something very simple, yet very profound. If my inner world is the origin of my outer experience, then what exactly am I sustaining within myself throughout the day? Not just in my deliberate thoughts, but in the unnoticed assumptions, the silent beliefs, the emotional atmosphere I constantly inhabited without question. At first, I didn't like the answer, because I saw that I was not truly living from the state of success I wanted. I was visiting it in imagination, but returning to doubt in reality. I was entertaining possibility, but residing in uncertainty. And that split was costing me everything I was trying to achieve. This was the breaking point, not of failure, but of awareness. A point where I could no longer continue living mechanically, repeating the same inner patterns while expecting a different outer result. Something had to shift, not in action first, but in identity. Not in effort, but in assumption. And from that silent recognition, everything that followed began to unfold. It was in that inner stillness that something unexpected began to reveal itself to me. Not through struggle, not through more effort, but through a simple shift in attention. Because when a mind is no longer completely consumed by chasing outcomes, it becomes sensitive to subtler truths that were always present but previously ignored. I remember coming across a simple idea, something so ordinary that most would dismiss it immediately. 3 words, that was all. At first there was nothing impressive about them. No dramatic energy, no promise of instant transformation, nothing that the rational mind could cling to as proof. And yet something in me paused. Not because I understood it, but because I felt that understanding was not the requirement. Recognition was. These 3 words were not powerful because of their structure. They were powerful because of the state they pointed toward. At the surface they looked simple, but beneath them was an entirely different way of operating. One where reality is not something you wait for, but something you enter internally first. I did not treat them as a tool in the beginning. I treated them as an experiment. I began to repeat them inwardly, not with force, not with urgency, but with curiosity. And something very subtle started happening. My attention, which was previously scattered across doubt, worry, and external conditions, began to gather itself into a single direction. At first, nothing changed outside, and that is where most people abandon what they do not understand. They expect immediate reflection. They expect the world to respond as quickly as their desire appears. But I began to notice something more important. The change was not meant to begin outside. It was meant to begin within the one observing the world. The words started to act like a quiet anchor. Every time I drifted back into uncertainty, I would return to them, not as repetition for results, but as a return to a different state of being. And slowly, without force, my inner dialogue began to soften. The constant negotiation with reality, the endless questioning of how and when, started to lose its dominance. There was no moment of fireworks, no sudden emotional high. Instead, there was something far more powerful: stability. A sense that I was no longer being pulled in every direction by external appearances. I was beginning to inhabit something steadier within myself. And as I stayed with those three words, I began to understand something essential. Their purpose was not to change the world directly. Their purpose was to change the observer of the world. Because when the observer changes, the reflection must eventually follow. I noticed that I was no longer reacting to lack in the same way. I was no longer reinforcing it through attention and emotion. Instead, I was quietly withdrawing my agreement from it. And in that withdrawal, space was created for something new to emerge. The mind always assumes something. The question is never whether you are assuming, but what you are assuming consistently enough to feel real. And these three words became the bridge that allowed me to step out of old assumptions and gently inhabit a new one, without resistance. It was not about forcing belief, it was about entering a state where belief was no longer required, because experience itself was beginning to shift internally first. And from that shift, the next transformation naturally began to unfold. As I continued with those three words, something deeper than repetition began to take place within me. It was no longer about saying them. It was about becoming what they implied. Because words alone have no authority unless they are lived inwardly. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to notice that my relationship with myself was changing. There is a point where a person no longer simply desires something, but begins to question the identity from which that desire is arising. I started to see that the old version of me was built on uncertainty, on waiting, on hoping that something external would eventually validate me. But those three words were not speaking to my circumstances. They were speaking to my state of being. And so the real shift did not happen in my external routine. It happened in my inner identification. I began to ask myself, not in words but in feeling, who am I assuming myself to be right now? Because every moment of experience is filtered through that silent assumption. Not the words you say, but the state you inhabit while saying them. At first, doubt would still appear. Old conditioning does not disappear instantly. It returns out of habit. But something in me no longer fully agreed with it. It was as if I had stepped slightly outside of the identity that used to automatically accept limitation as truth. I was still hearing the same thoughts, but I was no longer surrendering to them in the same way. Instead of reacting, I began to observe, and in that observation a gap was created. A gap between thought and acceptance, between perception and identity. And in that gap, something powerful begins to emerge. Choice. Not the choice of action, but the choice of state. I started to notice that when I returned to those three words, I wasn't trying to convince myself anymore. I was aligning myself. And alignment is not forced. It is recognized. It feels like remembering something you had temporarily forgotten. There were moments when I would sit quietly and imagine from a different position of self. Not as someone trying to become successful, but as someone who already exists within a different inner reality. And in those moments, something subtle but undeniable would shift. My breathing would change, my tension would ease, my mind would stop negotiating, and I would find myself, even if briefly, inhabiting a different version of consciousness. That is where doubt loses its authority, not through argument, but through replacement, because you cannot maintain two identities at the same time. One will always weaken as the other strengthens. I began to understand that belief is not something you force. It is something that naturally follows identity. When you consistently assume a state, belief eventually conforms to it. And so instead of trying to believe in success, I began to inhabit the state that would naturally produce belief in it. This was the turning point within me. Because once identity begins to shift, effort becomes less strained, action becomes less desperate, and expectation becomes less fragile. I was no longer trying to reach a version of myself in the future. I was beginning to stand in it internally. Now, and from that inner position, everything I once struggled to chase began to feel strangely closer, as if reality itself was adjusting to meet the state I had finally accepted within myself. That is when the inner certainty began to take root. Once that inner shift had begun, It would have been easy to assume that everything would unfold instantly, as though the external world was obligated to mirror the change immediately. But experience does not respond to impatience, it responds to consistency. And so I entered a phase that was far less dramatic than people imagine, yet far more powerful than most ever sustain. I began to understand that the real work was not in occasional inspiration, but in daily embodiment. Not in peak moments of clarity, but in repeated return to the desired state, even when the senses insisted otherwise. Because the senses will always report what has already been formed, not what is being formed within. So I created a simple inner discipline, nothing rigid, nothing forced, but deliberate. Each day I would return to those 3 words, not as a ritual, but as a recentering, a way of stepping back into the state I had chosen to occupy. And every time I returned, I was not trying to add something new. I was removing what did not belong to the identity I was growing into. At times, the outer world would still look unchanged. And this is where most abandon the process. They mistake silence for absence, delay for denial, but I began to treat external conditions as irrelevant to inner alignment. Because if reality is a reflection, then the reflection must always follow the face, not lead it. So instead of asking, "Where is it?" I began to ask, "What am I being right now?" That question became more important than any physical evidence, because being is the source, and seeing is the result. There were moments when old thoughts would return with intensity. Thoughts of limitation, delay, and doubt would rise without warning. But instead of engaging with them, I treated them like passing weather. They could appear, but they were no longer allowed to define the climate of my identity. I would simply return again and again to the chosen state. And something remarkable begins to happen when repetition is no longer mechanical but conscious. The mind starts to lose its resistance. What once felt unnatural begins to feel familiar, and what feels familiar eventually becomes automatic. That is how identity is reformed, not in one decision, but in sustained return. I also began to notice changes in my emotional responses. I was no longer reacting with the same urgency to external events. There was a subtle distance forming between me and the appearance of things, not detachment in the sense of indifference, but stability. A sense that I was no longer being moved so easily by what was temporary. My imagination also became more active, but in a calmer way. I would naturally find myself revisiting the end state, not as wishful thinking, but as inner residence. And the more I did this, the less effort it required. It began to feel less like practice and more like recognition. Even my daily actions started to shift without force. I was no longer acting from anxiety or lack. Decisions began to feel clearer, less emotionally charged. There was a quiet confidence growing within me, not because circumstances had changed, but because my inner position had stabilized. And slowly I began to realize that consistency is not about repetition alone. It is about loyalty to a state, even when appearances challenge it. That is where transformation is truly tested, not in moments of certainty, but in moments of contradiction. But I remained with it quietly, steadily, without needing immediate proof. And from that steady inner alignment, something began to move in the world that I could not yet see clearly, but could already feel unfolding. And then something began to happen that I did not force, and I did not predict in any detailed way. It did not arrive as a sudden explosion of change, but as a quiet rearrangement of life itself. At first it was so subtle that if I had been obsessed with instant proof, I might have missed it entirely. The first signs were not financial, they were directional. Small shifts in timing, conversations that would not have happened before, opportunities that appeared almost casually, as if they had been there all along, but were now simply becoming visible to me. It felt less like I was attracting something, and more like I was no longer blocking what was already moving toward me. People began to respond differently, not because they had consciously changed, but because my inner state was no longer meeting them in the same way. Where there was once hesitation, there was now clarity. Where there was once neediness, there was now quiet certainty. And life in its natural way adjusts to the signal being broadcast. I noticed that ideas started to come without effort. Not forced thinking, but natural inspiration. Solutions would appear in moments when I was not actively searching for them. It was as though the mind, once no longer filled with noise and contradiction, became a clearer channel for direction to flow through. And with that, my actions began to change in quality. I was no longer acting from urgency or fear of missing out. I was acting from a place of quiet knowing. Even when I didn't have full external evidence, I no longer felt internally delayed. That shift alone changes everything, because action taken from certainty carries a different weight than action taken from desperation. I also began to notice that certain doors simply stopped closing in the same way they used to. Not every path opened, but enough began to align that I could no longer dismiss the pattern. It was not randomness, it was coordination, a kind of silent agreement between inner state and outer experience. There were moments where something would present itself externally that perfectly matched what I had been dwelling in internally. And in those moments there was no surprise, only recognition, as if the world was finally catching up to a decision that had already been made within. But perhaps the most important change was not in what appeared, but in how I experienced waiting. Waiting no longer felt like lack. It felt like unfolding. Time itself seemed to lose its pressure, because I was no longer measuring life by absence. I was living from presence, and even when movement was slow, I no longer interpreted it as failure. I understood that the external world moves in its own rhythm, but it always moves in response to a deeper internal cause. That understanding removed the emotional weight that once made delay feel like denial. There was also a strange sense of continuity developing. It was as though I was no longer experiencing isolated events, but a connected stream of unfolding outcomes, all linked back to a single inner shift. And that realization brings a kind of quiet power with it, because once you see the pattern, you stop breaking it with doubt. I did not announce the change, I did not chase validation for it. I simply observed it as it became undeniable in its consistency. And the more I observed, the more natural it became to remain in the state that was producing it. Because at a certain point you no longer need to convince yourself that something is working. You simply recognize that life is responding, even if not yet completed. And from that recognition, the final result was already quietly on its way. And then came the moment that from the outside would be called the result. But from the inside, it felt less like arrival and more like completion of a process that had already been decided long before it became visible. The number itself, 68 million, is not where the truth of this experience lies, because numbers can impress, but they cannot transform a life unless you understand the consciousness that allowed them to appear. What matters is not what came, but what state remained steady long enough for it to come. There was no single dramatic moment where everything suddenly changed overnight. Instead, there was a sequence of events that aligned so naturally that it felt almost inevitable in hindsight. What once seemed distant began to move closer, not through struggle but through synchronization. Opportunities that were once uncertain began to stabilize. Conversations that once felt like exploration became confirmation. Paths that once seemed blocked began to open without force. And through it all, there was a quiet recognition within me that nothing external was truly random anymore. It was responding to something deeper that had already been established within. I did not experience this as a reward. I experienced it as reflection. Because when you remain in a state long enough, life does not negotiate with your desires, it mirrors your assumption. And once that becomes clear, the entire idea of waiting for success dissolves into something far more immediate, being the cause rather than the observer of delay. When the result finally became undeniable, there was no overwhelming shock within me. There was gratitude, yes, but also familiarity, as if part of me had already lived it inwardly so completely that its physical appearance was simply the final step of confirmation. That is the strange nature of inner assumption. It always precedes outer evidence, even when the delay makes it seem otherwise. But what mattered most was not the arrival of wealth, it was the realization of authority, the understanding that my inner state had not been passive but creative, that what I had consistently occupied in consciousness had been organizing itself into form long before I could physically measure it. And in that realization, something deeper than success emerged, a responsibility. Because once you see that experience is shaped from within, you can no longer return to unconscious living in the same way. You begin to observe yourself more carefully, not with fear, but with awareness of cause. I also understood that the number, regardless of scale, was never the point, because if the state is mastered, expression is only a matter of degree, not possibility. What appears as extraordinary externally is simply ordinary internally sustained long enough to manifest. There was also a quiet release that followed. Not attachment to outcome, but understanding of process. I no longer saw life as something happening to me, but as something responding through me. And that changes the relationship a person has with every desire they ever hold. Even now, when I reflect on it, the most important truth is not what was gained, but what was discovered. That assumption, when consistently embodied, does not ask permission from circumstance. It simply unfolds through it. And so, if there is one thing I leave behind in this experience, it is this realization. The moment you truly accept a state within yourself, life has no choice but to reorganize around it.